Our reading today is an excerpt from the poem The Wound Dresser by Walt Whitman. It contains a few lines of graphic descriptions of battlefield injuries, so please feel free to care for yourselves or care for your young ones if you feel these images may be distressing. In this poem, written during the Civil War in 1865, Whitman paid tribute to the hospital wound dresser, a solitary hero who bestowed empathy as well as bandages upon the young men whose bodies were rent in battle. Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where the priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital. To the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another, I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant, holding a tray, carries refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go, I stop, with hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds. I am firm with each, the pangs are sharp yet unavoidable. One turns to me, his appealing eyes, poor boy, I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you if that would save you. Thus in silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young. Some suffer so much. I recall the experience, sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms around this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips.
This weekend, we honor veterans of the United States Armed Forces. I invite you to join me now in honoring the veterans among us, but let us please do so in respectful silence. Would those veterans present who wish to be recognized please stand or raise a hand? With a hand to our hearts, we acknowledge and honor your sacrifice. And we now invite those who have loved ones in the armed forces, past or present, we invite you to please rise or raise a hand to be recognized. Likewise, we honor your sacrifice and that of your families. And finally, let us add a moment of silence for all the civilians and for the earth itself who are suffering this moment from acts of war. Thank you. Before I begin, I just want to call out for you that this sermon does contain some brief descriptions of the atrocities of war and mentions the topics of suicide and intimate partner violence. So please care for your hearts. Feel free to step away for a moment if you need to. Dear ones, as yet again, armed conflicts rage across our planet, and as the threat of war casts long shadows, we are invited to reflect on the tremendous costs of war. Costs measured in lives lost and dollars spent may seem proper measures, but we must also remember to take into account the dear cost of lives shattered among those who survive. This Veterans Day, I'm thinking of all those soldiers, sailors, and Marines who come back to us after war, but who have left their old, innocent selves on the battlefield. Many come back changed, sometimes forever. What has died is not their physical body, but their moral universe, their sense of right and wrong, their very idea of God, if you will. So this morning I want to engage you in a conversation about the moral injury of war. And as we embrace our November theme of collectively, we as a society are invited to examine our collective responsibility to face up to the full, sometimes hidden costs of war. From early childhood, most of us are taught the basics of right and wrong. The dominant groups in this society view Jewish and Christian scripture as the basis for morality. And many of us learn the 10 Commandments, for example. Among these, thou shalt not steal or covet. Thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not kill. In theistic traditions, including in our own historical universalism, we are taught that God is love. And many believe the Gospels when they say, even the very hairs of your head are numbered. And then, as young people often, who are still in full formation of their identities, we ship them off to war where their entire moral universe is turned upside down. Rather than not coveting and not stealing, we tell them to take land, to destroy villages, to wipe out crops and forests. Rather than honoring fathers and mothers, we take away their beautiful children and send them off to slaughter. Rather than telling the truth, we often go to war based on lies. And rather than "thou shalt not kill," we place an automatic weapon in soldiers' hands and tell them that thy neighbor, whom they've been taught to love, is now a target. Even if someone escapes physical harm, imagine what damage this can do to the soul. And that very idea is the premise of the book Soul Repair by Rita Nakashima Brock and Gabriella Latini. This damage to souls is what they call the fierce angel of moral injury. Moral injury, they write, results when soldiers violate their core moral beliefs. And in evaluating their behavior negatively, they feel they no longer live in a reliable, meaningful world, that they can no longer be regarded as decent human beings. And this can leave them with feelings of worthlessness, remorse, and despair. And those negative self-judgments can torment a soul for a lifetime, unquote. In 2012, Brock and Latini, these authors, noted that veterans were only 7% of the U.S. population, but accounted for a staggering 20% of suicides. That's like one every 80 minutes. And the trends today are not much better. The U.S. Army, for example, reported in 2021 that the suicide rate is the highest it's been since 1938. The moral trauma of war is made worse by re-entry into civilian life. Military personnel bring home these horrors that they're holding, carrying them back to a nation that's not willing to accept responsibility for war. We greet them with parades and thanks for their service, if they're lucky. More often than not, we greet them with silence and just go on with our lives. You know, we need to turn away, to dispose of war. Our government has even imposed media blackouts on images of flag-draped coffins returning home. But we have a responsibility to face the truth, to look our returning veterans in the eye, not to look away, and not to hide behind flags. They still belong to us, Brock and Latini write. They are still the people we love, and we cannot build a different humanity or different world without facing that fierce angel of moral injury together, unquote. I once made the acquaintance of a young man who had served in Iraq. He was a loving, outgoing guy, but very troubled. His body was intact, but as I later found out, his soul had been deeply injured. He put on a brave face, but he finally had to share that he was so shaken up and profoundly sad about the sudden death of his best friend. He told me that the two of them were home watching TV, and my friend went to the fridge to grab a drink, and when he came back, he found his companion collapsed on the floor. A brain aneurysm, he said. He was in shock, in grief. But it was only much later that he confessed to me that the event of his friend's death was true, but the setting had been a lie. His best friend was actually killed in combat in Iraq, right in front of him. One moment he was there, the next he was in 1,000 pieces. The horror was so great he couldn't even find a way to tell me about it. And he assumed that I couldn't possibly understand. And honestly, I'm sure I couldn't. This is the survivor's guilt that plagues so many returning veterans. Why was I spared when my friend was not? Couldn't I have done something to prevent it? And the trauma can be multi-layered. Another time I was chatting with an Army veteran. I don't remember how we got on the subject, but I ended up saying something like, accidentally killing a child would have to be about the worst thing that could ever happen to a person. I must have been thinking about a kid running into the street or a car that sideswipes a bike. My companion became oddly quiet. After some coaxing, he finally shared that he had been on a mission in Iraq that had gone horribly wrong. Children were not the target of the mission, of course. But an innocent girl had become what they call collateral damage. As it turns out, my statement had been exactly right. It was the worst thing that could ever happen. And it happened to my friend. I became angry with myself, of course, for triggering him, for stirring up the most disturbing memories that a soldier could have. I tried to be there for him, but he lashed out, telling me to stop trying to fix him, because nothing could. It's hard to love someone who feels that they're unlovable. But we can't give up. We can't give up. We have to embrace these wounded fellow human beings and acknowledge that their injuries may be of the mind and the heart and not always visible to us. We must create a place of grace. We must commit ourselves to the delicate work of healing the soul. Soul repair, Brock and Latini write, is how we hold on to our own humanity and how at the same time we can face the unbearable truths of who we can be in war. In the end, they write, war and its aftermaths belong to all of us and are our responsibility. As a church community, then, what are we called to do collectively for our returning veterans? How can we be that place of grace for those who have suffered trauma? Trauma may be from the moral injury of war, but soul repair also applies for those traumatized by intimate partner violence or other forms of abuse. Jennifer Baldwin, the author of a 2018 book called Trauma-Sensitive Theology, is a trauma survivor, a minister, a theologian, and a clinical psychologist. Churches, she laments, have often failed to be at the forefront of healing for those with trauma, and often were the very source of trauma. Because churches aren't good at offering trauma care, survivors are left feeling misunderstood, sometimes even re-traumatized. I wholeheartedly agree with Baldwin when she says that theology has a job to do. It has to matter to someone who is suffering. In coming to this work, she realized that if a particular theological frame offers no assistance or no comfort to someone in the dark nights of the soul at 3 o'clock in the morning, then it's not a theology that matters to me. So Baldwin set out to create a theological framework that supports trauma survivors. She offers 4 commitments. 4 commitments that religious communities need to make to provide trauma-informed care. The first is the priority of bodily experience. Trauma, as many of us are learning, it lives in the body. Our very cells remember it. And our hormones relive it. And that means faith-based or intellectual approaches alone cannot return a body to resilient health. Protestant theological traditions, including ours, however, have favored rationality over embodied forms of theology. But we have to learn to get back in touch with our bodies. They are essential to theological health and resilience. The second commitment is full acceptance of trauma narratives. Trauma survivors of all kinds live in shame or in mortal fear of not being believed. Trauma survivors feel that the original injury is already great enough. But when the rest of us live in denial, we are literally adding insult to injury. We have to learn to trust that survivors know their own stories, and rather than questioning or trying to rationalize them, we tell them we believe them, that they are in a safe place to bare their souls. Third, says Baldwin, we have to accept that human beings, no less trauma survivors, are multi-layered and inconsistent. It's complicated. For example, we often find ourselves divided. Parts of me want and think this, while other parts of me want and think that. Baldwin claims that honoring this multiplicity fully honors the traumatic injury. But it also holds on to the great variety of resources that a person has for resiliency. Like with my friend, I had to hold the fact that he was deeply fearful that he had become a damaged, worthless human being, but that he was also genuinely reaching out for friendship and life. The fourth and final commitment that Baldwin lays out is to have faith in the robust resiliency of trauma survivors. Clergy and supportive members of our faith community have to do more than just accept the narrative of brokenness. The fear of brokenness that survivors often feel is very real, but it's not the whole story. We have to believe in our guts that resilience and healing are possible. We have to offer a compassionate theology and resources that support healing. Baldwin concludes that it's the keeping of this sacred promise that keeps survivors going through the dark times. Faith in resiliency, she writes, must be protected and nourished for grace and life to have the enduring word. What work of love are we called to as a collective body? I would offer that the greatest gifts we can give our wounded and traumatized beloveds are faith, hope, and love. Faith that there is something larger holding them, and faith in the preciousness of their life, even if they feel like that life is hanging by a thread. A hope that they will never walk alone, and that healing and redemption are available to them. And most of all, dear ones, like the wound dresser of old, let us simply love them. Let our hearts be broken open to receive them in all their messy complexity. As the poet implores, let us sit by the restless all the dark night. May we feel many a soldier's loving arms about our necks, and may many a soldier's kiss dwell upon our lips. So may it be.